So today we're going to look at the exchange variation, which starts with e4, c6, d4, d5, and white capturing on d5. So the bulk of this, we're going to look at the Panov attack, which is much more challenging and aggressive, but we'll start briefly by covering bishop d3, which is a sideline, and not very good, but it's at least a little bit challenging. So black should start with knight c6 to put immediate pressure on this d4 pawn. White has a few options. If he plays knight f3, after bishop g4, black has an extremely comfortable position. For example, c3, e6, and it's more or less like black has an extra tempo in a sort of typical Carlsbad structure. So much more common is the move c3 with the intention of playing against this bishop on c8 and trying to keep him passive. And here I'm going to give you guys two options, one of which is a little more combative than me, but they're both quite fine for black. The first option is simple developing, knight to f6. Again, if white plays a knight f3 type move, simply bishop g4 should lead to a totally fine position for black. So what white's normally doing now is playing the move bishop f4, trying to get his pieces out, and then after bishop g4, which I'd recommend to try to get your bishop outside of the pawn chain before playing e6, white's playing queen b3 and trying to immediately take advantage of the fact that black is leaving his queen side unattended. But with a couple accurate moves, black is absolutely fine. So queen c8, I think this is best because we want to protect b7 while not allowing any sort of tricks on knight e5. Queen d7 is playable, but I think I'm a little skeptical of something like this because knight e5 is always coming very quickly. In any case, I don't think it's worth it. Much easier is queen c8. And now they're playing knight d2, e6, knight f3, bishop e7, and now something like castles. And here, I think this is one sort of important moment. I would say that black should play the move bishop to h5 directly now. And I think that he has quite a fine position. It seems like he's doing very well. I would caution against castling. I think that even here black is doing quite fine, but after knight e5, it's just a little bit uncomfortable in some situations. But bishop h5 first is very good. And the point is we're going to meet knight e5 with knight takes e5 and knight d7. So depending on what it does, we'll see. So, for example, if d takes e5 after knight d7, the structure should be extremely good for black. He can quickly drop his bishop back to g6, exchange off the wide squared bishops and play queen c6 and play for a minority attack. For example, let's say, I don't know what white does, waste time, h3. Well, now knight c5 is good, so we got to make a better move than that. But already it's quite difficult for white. Let's say something like queen c2, bishop g6, exchange, knight f3. Here black can start a simple minority attack on the queen side. He'll play like b5, b4. He can leave his king in the center if he so chooses, if he wants to use the h-file for the rook, but castling is quite fine as well. And black can start to break on the queen side with moves like b4, up in the b-file and the c-file, and he should have quite a good position. So knight e5 really loses a lot of its sting. If he takes with the bishop, then white's got a decent try. I think another decent move is to play knight to d7, with the idea to immediately put pressure on this knight. I don't think black is worried at all about the knight taking in either case, just some kind of, if knight c6, probably black can even take with the pawn and play c5 very quickly. And if knight d7, just queen d7, and black cannot possibly be worse here. He just has a totally fine position, a lot of bishops will get exchanged, and he can hope to get a minority attack in the long run. Meaning like, we'll play bishop g6, exchange these bishops, bishop d6, exchange these bishops, and someday play rook b8 and shove the b pawn to make a minority attack. I mean, it's more or less equal, but black certainly can continue. So yeah, I think knight d7 is a good move here, and I think black has absolutely no problems. So that's one possibility. The other possibility I'll offer is a little bit more combative, and I think also entirely fine, which is queen to c7. And now the point of this move is to try to immediately take control of this diagonal before white can put the bishop there. So white has a few options. He can try something like knight e2 to try to immediately get bishop f4 in, but I don't really believe in this. For example, knight f6. If white plays bishop f4, I think black can probably play e5. And I think he should be quite fine. Bishop g4 is a thought as well, which I think is quite reasonable. And in general, this position strikes me as being entirely fine for black. Bishop g5 is kind of a tricky move, but I think after a strong move, knight f6, just not worrying with the pawn structure, if white takes, black will recapture this way, and they'll hope to use the open g-file on a kingside attack, and so play bishop d7, castle along, and get e5 in. Should be quite fine. And if knight f3, bishop g4, knight bd2, e6. If white were to just play a simple move here like castles after bishop d6, I think black has a very good position. It's sort of just a reverse Carlsbad. Now, probably white should not be worse because, it's a Queen's Gambit, but, Queen's Gambit's one of the more solid openings, and normally black is doing all right there, even down, and here white's playing the black side up a tempo, so white shouldn't be worse necessarily, but black is extremely comfortable. I mean, I might even be a little bit more comfortable with black. What some people are trying is knight f1, with the idea to play knight g3 and then run this bishop out of squares. And here I'd recommend, I think another good moment to play bishop h5 is, and black will simply retreat the bishop to g6 and have an absolutely fine position. I don't think white has any serious attacking chances. So anyhow, that's sort of, this is not critical at all, this bishop d3 stuff, but if you don't know what you're doing and someone hits you with an annoying sideline, it can be a little awkward to deal with over the board. So hopefully this gives a reasonable impression of how black can defend, and just remember this bishop h5 move often you want to make before it seems necessary. It's a good prophylactic idea to bring the bishop around to g6, and in both the variations I presented, I believe black is absolutely fine, and the results that he showed reflect that this opinion is correct. In any case, I think we should move on to the Panov attack, which starts with c4. And this is leading to a much more complicated game. Starts now. White's trying to get a typical isolated queen pawn position, and I know a lot of people disagree with me, but I think that in general I don't like playing isolated queen pawn positions where the white square bishop is inside the pawn chain. So after the normal main line, knight f6, knight c3, a lot of people are playing e6 here, but this isn't quite to my taste. I think that white has chances to get an attack here. I don't know all the exact moves. It's some knight f3, and the take queen c2, and it's some castle, bishop d3, bishop e7, a3, it's something like this, I don't know exactly. Knight c6, castle, knight f6, rook d1, but somehow I believe white has attacking chances here because he can put pressure on the king side for not much real counterplay because this bishop on c8 is not very active. If that bishop were to migrate to g4 and then again drop around to g6 at some point, black would be absolutely fine, probably a bit better from the isolated pawn. So I'm going to recommend we try to implement a strategy where black delays playing e6 so that he can try to develop the white square bishop. So it starts off by playing knight c6. And now white has two main options here, bishop g5 and knight to f3. So with bishop g5, I believe black should capture on c4. And he's going to sort of go pawn hunting. So white has a few options. If he plays d5, which is the most aggressive, black should play knight e5, and then after queen d4, actually knight f3 is feasible as well. Grandmaster Alex Onashuk played this against me once, but after bishop g4, I think white's best move is to take on c4, and now knight c4, queen a4 check, queen d7, queen c4, and white's a bit ahead in development here, so black has to be careful. But I do think that he has a quite good position if he reacts properly. So I think the best move is to capture on f3, and then play rook to c8, and see where the white queen wants to go. So let's say the queen goes like d4. I'm going to recommend playing h6. Now if white captures on f6, you take with the e-pawn, castle, bishop d6. White can give a check if he so desires, but I don't think it's very consequential because the black king is absolutely safe on f8, and his pieces are extremely active. So I wouldn't worry about this at all. Like if white, let's say, plays, I don't know, h4 to save his pawn, bishop e5. Already there's problems on c3. And black can play g6, king g7, and he'll play h5, fix the pawn on h4. The king on g7 will be entirely safe. Another move here might be something like queen f5. In any case, I think black's totally fine here. White usually play like bishop h4, and now g5, bishop g7, and I think black has an entirely fine position. Looks to me like both sides have some pawn weaknesses, but realistically black's got nice development and good pieces. I see no reason for black to be unhappy. But queen d4 is more critical. And now I'd recommend a very strong move h6 to dislodge this bishop from g5. Now, if white takes the knight and takes the pawn, it looks like he's winning a pawn here, but really black is totally fine, probably a bit better already actually. And for example, if queen takes g5, black has a pleasant choice between something like queen b6, hitting b2, and then after like bishop b3, knight g4, hitting f2, and like queen f4, g5, bishop comes to g7. Black has extremely good compensation for a pawn because all his pieces are so good. Or if you're a little bit more materialistic like I am, just simply queen c7 forks the bishop in h2, and black is better. So that's totally fine. The one game I got from this position continued queen e2, and white was hoping with this move to play knight f3, knight e5, but after a strong move g4, white was all tied up, and he lost very quickly. The game continued castles. Rook c8, king d1, queen b6, king a1, g6, and alright, with the bishop coming to g7 and the long diagonal becoming a problem, well, white did not survive very long. So that's not really an issue. Much more critical is a move like bishop to f4, knight to g6. And now some people are capturing on c4 here, but personally I believe that after knight takes f4 and g5, black will quickly play bishop g7, castle, and he's got the two bishops. In particular, his dark square bishop is extremely good, and he has excellent control over the dark squares, while white still has the isolated queen pawn. I would be lying to you if I said that black is just much better here, because his kingside is a little tender, but I do think that he has at least comfortable equality. For example, I don't know, queen d2, bishop g7, knight f3, castle, and, well, bishop castles, and say something like bishop d7, black quickly plays rook c8, and it seems quite good for black. So that's not really an issue. Much more aggressive is the move bishop to g3. And now white's hoping to play bishop takes c4 and maintain his development and space advantage, but black should be ready for a fight. Starting with e6. Okay, so bishop takes c4 is met by e takes d5, and black has a good position. For example, knight takes d5 already is embarrassing because bishop b4 check, and, well, white's worse. So normally white will try d6 here, and if white can maintain this blockade on the bishop on f8, if he can simply play bishop takes c4, castle long, I mean, black's going to be stuck and more or less losing. So black has to sort of find a way to break this blockade. Luckily, there is a way that exists, which is the sort of weird but strong knight e7, using the pin to the queen on d4 to try to reroute the knight to f5. And there are a lot of complications here. For example, there's like, I think, well, one common idea is like rook d1, knight f5, queen c4 takes, and now a lot of the time they might even just ignore that knight on g3 and play knight b5, and there's something like knight d5, and then it's like, I think rook d5 takes, knight c7, king here, and then it's like check on g4, I want to say, takes here, takes. And at the end of all this, white ended up with an extra piece, but his extra piece is the knight in the corner. He's going to promptly get trapped. Black plays like queen a5 check, I want to say. King d1, queen a4 check. Now king c1, I think, is losing somehow to bishop d6. But normally they're playing b3, and now queen g4 check. Exchange, and black quickly just bishop back, like let's say f3, bishop back to d7, black plays bishop d6 and recollects the knight on a8. So like, there's a lot of complications here, and to really show what's going on in this position after knight e7, first of all, by the way, this is a position that's only been played a few times, and after, basically black's been playing, like after rook d1, they've been playing knight to d5 every time, and after like bishop c4, bishop d6, it's always been equal. And that's fine if you want a sort of boring position, but I kind of like this whole knight f5 stuff with complete insanity. But that being said, to really delve into all the possibilities after rook d1, knight f5, and castle long, knight f5, will probably take like a 10-part video series, so I'll just sort of leave it at that. But I will tell you that with all my investigation, I think black is doing well. In any case, let's move on to the more main moves. Bishop takes c4 is mainly played now, and I'm going to recommend the move h6 for black. So the point of this move is we're trying to dislodge this bishop on g5, and I think that black will have a fine position. If white captures on f6 after e takes f6, black is absolutely fine because his bishops are going to be active and he'll have good files for his rooks. It's almost not worth looking at. Something like knight f3, bishop d6. White probably should be concerned about bishop g4, so like castle, castle, and say like h3. If black can play bishop g4, it's possible white will simply lose some central pawns. So let's say h3, but just bishop f5, and I mean black's pieces are so active, and white has this slightly healthier pawn structure, but black can quickly put pressure on the d-pawn by like playing queen d7, rook d8. I see no reason at all for black to be unhappy. Some more critical are bishop moves. If bishop h4, queen takes d4 looks dangerous, but I've basically more or less worked it out to a forced draw. If anyone wants to see that, you can check out another video I did on my game with Mondiza, where I actually cited my game with Hess. But another more combative move is e6, and I think black is doing quite well here because this bishop on h4 is misplaced. Basically, I know I already said that you don't want this bishop on c8 inside the pawn chain, but the problem for white is that after something like knight f3, bishop e7, say like castles, and I don't know, like queen e2. Probably now already knight takes d4 is good for black, so white has to be a little careful. It's something like rook e1 is more natural. In b6, black will quickly put the bishop on b7. White's real problem is this bishop on h4 is misplaced. What he wants to do is respond to h6 by moving the bishop back to like e3, so that he can quickly organize queen d2 and some sacrifice. Because h6 is a weakening move in the sense that sacrifices could be coming, but it's very hard to actually sacrifice anything here, because there's no way to get to the h6 pawn. And as a result, I think black has a totally fine position. So that's one possibility. White also can retreat the bishop, but here I think black is quite fine again, starting with e6, and then let's say knight f3. And here I think it's important. Normally the bishop is best on e7, but in this case, because we've played h6, we're making more weaknesses. I'd recommend a slightly more ambitious setup with bishop to d6. And again, I showed this. This is exactly what happened in my game with Mondiza. And black's basic plan is to go like after castles, let's say. Castles and, I don't know, let's say like rook e1. Black will want to play the move knight to e7 and reroute this knight to f5, which will shut down this diagonal, which is really annoying. Protect h6, oftentimes threaten to exchange here, and he'll have the other diagonal here open for his bishops, and I think black has a quite fine position. But he does need to play this way, i.e. a little bit more ambitiously. Note that he's able to do this because white was never able to play bishop g5, because once it got kicked away, it could never come back. If the bishop could be on g5 here and take on f6 and butcher the pawns, there'd be problems. So all that I think is quite fine for black. I'll briefly mention another move, which is knight f3, and now bishop g4. And if white plays complacently with a move like bishop e2, I think already after, let's say d takes c4, bishop takes c4, e6, castle, bishop e7, I think already black is even slightly more comfortable, because white has the isolated pawn, but he's got no potential to attack, and he has serious weaknesses to deal with. So what white is mostly doing is playing more aggressively cd5, knight d5, queen b3, trying to generate some attack. Now, here I'd recommend capturing an f3 to butcher the pawn structure. It looks like white can sort of get tricky by taking on b7, but I think after knight db4, white simply loses, takes rook b8, and the queen is trapped. So white has to capture on f3, and now e6, queen b7, knight d4, bishop b5. There's some long forcing line. Takes, queen c6, king e7, queen b5. And in general, there's some endgame after queen d7, which I think is very slightly worse for black, but realistically he's going to hold. You can look that up, and I think there's some good examples. I'm going to recommend the move knight c3, which is a little bit more combative. And then bc3. And now, there was some Fischer game that went queen d7 here, but I don't recommend this. I think black should try to keep the queens on the board and play rook b8. And I think that black has a fine position. It's very, very messy and complicated, but ultimately I think black's doing well. So, for example, just to show how easy it is to mess up, after bishop a3, which looks like a very natural move, developing a piece with tempo, after king f6, white can resign. He's losing a piece after like queen a4, bishop takes a3. If he takes back, queen d3, and suddenly like rook b1 is a threat out of nowhere. Rook d1, rook b1 doesn't change anything. And if like queen c1, rook b5, and the white king is amusingly mated in the center. So It's very easy to mess up. The best move is queen c5 check, and queen takes a7, and white clips a pawn, but after bishop d6, the white king is just so vulnerable. For something like castles, both rook b5 and queen h4, I think, lead to very promising initiative. There's other moves as well after bishop d6. I mean, there's bishop e3, queen f6, where black's getting counterplay. There's bishop f4, trying to exchange bishops after takes. Check, king e7, takes, queen a5. You know, black's gonna get very well active pieces and probably take back one of the queenside pawns. In any case, I'd recommend this move rook to b8, and again, this is another one of those really complicated positions that would take me like 10 videos to explain what's totally going on, but you know, I'd recommend playing them, and they're complicated, they're interesting, and I think objectively black's fine. And lastly, I'd like to cover the pseudo Panov, which goes all the way back to the beginning, and that's if white plays d4, e4, c6, and then c4. And so after d5, he wants to exchange everything. Or sorry, not e5. Exchange everything. And then try to like do something tricky here. He's got a few options. He can try knight c3, knight takes d5, knight f3, with the idea that after something like knight c6, bishop c4, that you won't be able to play your bishop g4 move. This is to try to keep the bishop inside the pawn chain. I got this position twice, once against Grandmaster Gureyev when I was quite a bit younger, and I played e6, and, well, Timur immediately played d4, and I got my bishop stuck inside the pawn chain, and Timur won a very nice attacking game. But after looking at this a little bit more, I decided that after knight to b6, which is a very strong move, white has absolutely nothing. So bishop to b3, and now we see the point, bishop f5, and the bishop does get outside the pawn chain. And after d4, e6, quite simply, black is very easily equalizing. I got this position against Grandmaster Sarawan, he's like 2650. I was playing black, and I made a very easy draw because white had to play d5 at some moment, or else he's just going to have the isolated queen pawn, but my bishop outside the pawn chain means he has no attack. So that's fine for black. White can try to give some checks, like queen f4 check, and then here I'd recommend knight bd7, and then they're playing like knight c3, g6, and black's goal is to simply play bishop g7, castle, and then recover the d5 pawn. So white has two main options, castle, bishop g7, and white can play like bishop c4, or no, excuse me, I think queen b3 is more accurate. If bishop c4, I think after a6, it's a little bit awkward. Oh no, this is just a different option. Bishop c4, a6, castles, and white has to be careful here. If he plays a move like d3 after b5, he's going to lose a piece, because some kind of like takes, which normally looks good because of the pin. Now that this knight is not pinned, black plays knight to b6, hitting the queen and defending the rook, and next move he'll take back on b5. So white's playing like queen a3 instead of d3. And here I'd recommend just b6, and they're just playing like rook e1, rook e8, d3, bishop b7. And I think ultimately black will recapture the pawn on d5 by playing moves like b5, rook c8, and he'll play like knight b6 or knight c5, and I think that black will recapture the pawn without too much difficulty and have a very good position with nice active bishops. So another line is queen b3, with the idea that he's going to meet a6 with a4. So say like castles, bishop c4, now a6, a4, and if black plays a move like knight b6 after, say, d3, it's a little bit tricky to figure out how black hopes to get his pawn on d5 back. And I think even here black has decent play, but it's not quite what we wanted. White will play bishop e3, black doesn't really want to fix the white pawns. It should be at least somewhat better for white. So after a4, I recommend the move queen to a5. I think black is doing very well. The point of this move is that you want to play b5. So for example, let's say castles, black immediately plays b5, and I think white's actually losing. Say like bishop e2, of course not a takes b5 because queen a1. So like bishop e2, knight c5, and then like queen c2, bishop f5, d3, b4, knight, I don't know, somewhere horrible, b1, rook c8, like forcing queen d1 and knight takes d5, like white's just completely lost. Black's pieces got way too active and he took the pawn back. So allowing b5 essentially is like resigning. So white's usually playing like a move like rook a3 here, which looks awkward, feels awkward, and is awkward. So black plays something like knight b6, castle, rook d8, and now white can play rook e1 and try to counterattack the e7 pawn, but I'm going to recommend you just give him that pawn. Say like knight takes c4, queen c4, knight d5, take, Despite being down a pawn, I think that black is better in this endgame because the white bishop on c1 is extremely bad, and the white pawns are easy to attack, and his pieces, particularly rook on a3, are just very silly. Black can play rook c8, rook c5, bishop c6. He's got very easy play, and I think that despite the extra pawn, white is actually slightly worse here. In any case, that covers queen a4 check. More common is, or another move is bishop to b5 check. And here again, I'd recommend knight b d7, and I think black's doing quite well. Like, for example, if white plays knight c3, black plays a6. If the bishop moves away after simply b5, black will play bishop b7, knight b6, and recollect the d5 pawn. So, and if white takes after a strong move, queen d7, and I think that you're simply going to take back the d5 pawn, and black will have a good position. Because if queen b3, which looks like it defends, after queen g4, black will forget the pawn and play for the initiative. After, like, king f1, let's say, black simply plays e6, and is like, alright, keep your pawn, but, you know, good luck defending this position. Note that queen b7 would be a bad move because black has a trick here, which is bishop d5, hitting the queen, and g2, and if white takes it, queen d1 is going to promptly end the game. So, yeah, queen d7 is a good move there. And then after a6, sometimes people are playing, like, queen a4, but after rook b8, bishop d7 is forced to queen d7. I think black is absolutely fine. Again, white has to be concerned about the d5 pawn. So usually they exchange queens, and then I think they're playing like d4. And now strong move bishop f5. Black prepares rook d8 to recapture the pawn on d5, and he should be absolutely fine. In any case, this was sort of a very rapid-fire version of the Panov attack. I didn't really mean to go into any serious middle games here. I was just hoping that you can understand the opening and be able to play against the Panov, because really the Panov is not a try for an advantage at the very highest level. It's sort of a try to be tricky. And hopefully this will help you defang all the tricks. And I know it was a little rapid fire, so you might want to consider watching it a couple times. But in any case, that's all I got for today.